Welcome, everyone. Today we are diving into a fascinating period of global history, the beginning of European settlement in India. We will explore how shifting powers in Europe, the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance, and a desperate quest for spices completely redrew the map of the world and brought European ships to Indian shores. Let us get started. The year 1498 marked a massive turning point in history. When Vasco da Gama of Portugal arrived at Calicut, it kicked off a brand new era of trade between Europe and Asia. Initially, the Portuguese dominated this space, but soon the Dutch, English, and French trading companies followed suit. These were not just small merchant groups, they were massive commercial empires, backed by the naval supremacy of their home nations. Interestingly, early on, their activities were mostly limited to coastal port cities. They did not threaten local sovereignty right away. Instead, they brought in precious metals, or bullion, to exchange for Indian goods. This actually boosted India's foreign trade balance and spurred economic growth, which kept Indian rulers quite tolerant of their presence. To understand why Europeans suddenly started sailing across the globe, we have to look back at Europe itself. The end of the medieval period brought about the Renaissance, a word which literally means rebirth. Peaking between the 15th and 16th centuries, this era completely changed human intellect and the way of life. Before this, the understanding of the universe revolved almost entirely around religion and the concept of God. But the Renaissance sparked a scientific approach. Humans became the center of this new intellectual movement. This immense curiosity and desire to unfold the mysteries of the universe directly encouraged European rulers to sponsor adventurous seafarers to explore unknown, distant lands. Before these new sea voyages, how did goods actually get from Asia to Europe? During the Middle Ages, there were three main routes. The first went by sea along the Persian Gulf, overland through Iraq and Turkey, and then across the Mediterranean to Italy. The second went via the Red Sea, overland to Alexandria in Egypt, and then by sea to Italy. The third, though less popular, was an entirely overland path crossing the northwest frontier of India, traveling through Central Asia and Russia, all the way to the Baltic. Now, these traditional routes had a major bottleneck. In Asia, the trade was mostly handled by Arab merchants and sailors. Once the goods reached the Mediterranean, Italian merchants from cities like Venice and Genoa held a virtual monopoly. Every single state these goods passed through charged tolls and duties. You might think this would make trade impossible, but it remained incredibly profitable. Why? Because Europe had an absolute insatiable demand for Eastern spices, which were essential for preserving meat and flavoring food. Everything changed in the year 1453. The city of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, was the critical hinge connecting Asian and European trade. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured this city. Suddenly, all the old, established trade routes came under Turkish control. The Ottomans began levying heavy taxes on any goods passing through these routes. Almost overnight, the traditional spice trade became highly unprofitable for European merchants. With the Italians monopolizing the Mediterranean and the Ottomans blocking the East, Western European nations like Spain and Portugal were effectively shut out. They needed a solution. Their goals were very clear: break the Arab and Venetian monopolies, completely bypass the hostile Turkish-controlled territories, and establish direct, uninterrupted trade relations with the East. This economic necessity is what truly launched the search for new sea routes to India and the Spice Islands of Indonesia. This desperation for new routes led to rapid navigational breakthroughs. In 1487, a Portuguese navigator named Bartholomew Dias successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, proving that the ocean connected to the east. A few years later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west for Spain, hoping to hit India, but famously stumbled upon the Americas instead. Shortly after, an Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci participated in voyages for both Spain and Portugal to explore these new western lands, which were eventually named America in his honor. The breakthroughs continued, and the most crucial for our story happened in 1498, when Portugal's Vasco da Gama successfully navigated an all-sea route around Africa directly to India. A couple of decades later, in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan led an incredible expedition to circumnavigate the entire globe. He discovered the interoceanic passage now known as the Strait of Magellan and became the first European to cross the Pacific Ocean. Though Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines in 1521, his companions completed the journey, proving definitively the vast scale of the Earth's oceans. These voyages did not just map the world, they completely rewired the global economy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, global trade expanded in two massive ways. First, a huge influx of precious metals like gold and silver from the Americas flooded into Europe, providing the exact capital European manufacturers needed to grow. Second, the new Cape route to India opened up highly profitable direct Eastern trade. The impact was so profound that the famous economist Adam Smith later declared that the discovery of America and the Cape route to India were the two most important events in the history of mankind. You might wonder, why were Portugal and Spain the ones leading this charge? First, their people were deeply influenced by the Renaissance's spirit of adventure and scientific inquiry. Second, they had invested heavily in practical sciences, making them the most advanced nations in shipbuilding and navigation techniques. And crucially, these were not just rogue sailors. These expeditions were highly organized, sponsored, and strictly controlled by their respective national governments. Much of Portugal's early success can be traced to one man, Prince Henry, often called Henry the Navigator. He was the son of the King of Portugal and became absolutely obsessed with finding a safer route to India to bypass the Turks. But this was not just about trade. It was deeply tied to religion. In 1454, Pope Nicholas V granted Prince Henry official religious permission to invade, conquer, and subjugate non-Christian lands. This gave the Portuguese the religious authority they felt they needed to fight Islamic influence and spread the Christian faith alongside their commercial empires. With both Spain and Portugal claiming new lands across the globe, conflict was inevitable. To prevent a war between these two Catholic powers, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This treaty literally drew a line across the world. They established a north-to-south line of demarcation in the Atlantic Ocean, located about 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. The terms of this treaty were incredibly bold. Spain was given exclusive rights to explore and claim all lands west of this line, which is why most of South America speaks Spanish today. Portugal, on the other hand, was granted the rights to everything east of the line, which included the route around Africa and, crucially, India. The only rule was they could not overthrow an existing Christian ruler. By securing the Eastern Hemisphere, this treaty officially set the stage for the Portuguese to sail into Indian waters and establish their rule. Let us look at exactly how they did that next. Moving right into the 16th century, we see a major shift as European traders and soldiers began to enter and eventually conquer Asian territories. The Portuguese were entirely at the forefront of this effort. They wanted to find a direct sea route to India, primarily for trade, though they often portrayed it to the world as a Christian mission to spread their religion. Their true basic aim was to establish an absolute monopoly over the highly lucrative spice trade with Europe. To achieve this, they didn't rely on peaceful negotiation. They used brutal military force, engaging in acts of piracy, plunder, and inhumane cruelties. Within just 15 years of arriving in Indian waters, they had completely destroyed Arab navigation. The pivotal moment occurred in 1498 when Vasco da Gama arrived. He sailed with 3 ships, guided across the Indian Ocean by a skilled Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid, and landed at Calicut, also known as Kozhikode. At this time, Arab merchants held a strict monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean. The local ruler of Calicut, known as the Zamorin, actually disliked this Arab monopoly and welcomed Vasco da Gama, hoping for new trade opportunities. Da Gama stayed for 3 months and returned to Europe with a cargo of goods that sold for an astonishing 60 times the cost of his entire expedition. Naturally, this massive profit margin attracted many other European traders to the east. The Arab traders on the Malabar coast were rightfully apprehensive of the Portuguese, leading to continuous conflict. In 1502, Vasco da Gama returned to India with a clear, aggressive goal to completely exclude the Arabs and establish a Portuguese trade monopoly. However, the Zamorin refused to betray his Arab trading partners. This refusal set the stage for years of hostility. As a quick side note, it's fascinating to realize that the long, arduous sea route around the southern tip of Africa that Vasco da Gama used remained the primary trade route between India and Europe for nearly 400 years, right up until the Suez Canal was built in 1869. Before the 15th century, merchants from all over the world traded freely on Indian coasts without demanding exclusive rights. The Portuguese changed this entirely. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral traveled to Calicut and set up the first Portuguese factory, essentially a fortified warehouse. When locals attacked this factory, Cabral retaliated brutally by seizing Arab merchant ships, killing the crews, and burning the vessels. By 1502, Vasco da Gama was demanding exclusive trading rights, and when refused, he declared war on all non-Portuguese ships in the Arabian Sea. The audacity of this is captured perfectly in 1501, when the Portuguese king, Manuel I, officially proclaimed himself the Lord of Navigation, Conquest, and Trade over the entire region. To manage this growing empire, the Portuguese appointed governors, the first being Francisco de Almeida in 1505. His primary mission was to consolidate Portuguese power and disrupt Muslim trade networks by capturing key choke points like Aden, Ormuz, and Malacca. His defining moment came in 1509 at the Battle of Diu, where his forces defeated a massive joint naval fleet sent by the rulers of Egypt, Calicut, and Gujarat. This victory was monumental. It forced the Ottomans and Egyptians out of the Indian Ocean and secured a Portuguese trade monopoly for over a century. Almeida's overarching strategy was known as the Blue Water Policy, which focused entirely on naval supremacy rather than building a vast land empire. Almeida was succeeded in 1509 by Alfonso de Albuquerque, who is widely considered the real founder of the Portuguese Empire in India. Unlike Almeida, Albuquerque wanted territorial strongholds. In 1510, with the assistance of the Vijayanagar emperor, he attacked and captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur, establishing a key factory at Bangi. Albuquerque was also deeply involved in local administration. He encouraged his Portuguese men to take local wives, to build a loyal, mixed-heritage population, and he notably banned the practice of sati within Goa. Under his aggressive leadership, Portugal acquired Malacca in 1511 and Hormuz in 1515, dominating the entire Asian coastline. To enforce their dominance, the Portuguese utilized the cartaz system, an instrument of trade control first introduced by Vasco da Gama in 1502. The goal was simple: control and tax all trade carried out by rival merchants in the Indian Ocean. Under the system, captains of Indian or Arab ships were forced to buy licenses or passes from Portuguese authorities if they wanted to sail to destinations not controlled by Portugal. If a ship was caught without a pass, it was confiscated and its crew faced severe punishment. Furthermore, these passes explicitly banned ships from carrying highly profitable items like pepper, horses, ginger, and cinnamon, reserving these exclusively for the Portuguese monopoly. Alongside the cartaz system, the Portuguese implemented the kafila system. A kafila was essentially a naval convoy, a group of small, local merchant ships that traveled together under the heavy armed protection of a Portuguese naval fleet. This served a brilliant dual purpose for the Portuguese state. On one hand, it provided necessary security for local traders against pirates and rival European ships. On the other hand, it ensured that all these merchant ships were funneled directly into Portuguese-controlled ports, generating massive guaranteed revenue for the Portuguese customs houses. The next major governor was Nino da Cunha, who took charge in 1529. His most lasting administrative act was shifting the Portuguese headquarters from Cochin to Goa in 1530. During his tenure, he became deeply entangled in the politics of Gujarat, ruled by Bahadur Shah. When the Mughal Emperor Humayun attacked Gujarat in 1532, a desperate Bahadur Shah sought Portuguese military assistance. In exchange for their help, he ceded the territories of Bassein, Diu, Daman, and Bombay to the Portuguese in 1534. However, once Bahadur Shah regained his kingdom, he regretted the deal. Tensions flared, and in a dramatic turn of events, Bahadur Shah was assassinated by the Portuguese aboard a ship while trying to negotiate with them. Let's look closer at one of those ceded territories, Bassein, known today as the suburb of Vasai. Its history perfectly illustrates the shifting powers in India. The Portuguese had a small factory there since 1526, but officially took possession in 1534 through the treaty with the Sultan of Gujarat. They held it for over 2 centuries, until 1739, when the Maratha commander Chimaji Appa, serving under Baji Rao I, defeated the Portuguese and captured it. The Marathas held it until the British arrived. After briefly taking and returning it a few times, the British permanently secured Bassein under the Treaty of Bassein in 1802, eventually incorporating it into the Bombay Presidency in 1818. While they were expanding on the west coast, Governor da Cunha also attempted to increase Portuguese influence in the east, specifically in Bengal. However, their behavior there was atrocious. The Portuguese were heavily involved in piracy, smuggling, kidnapping, and the slave trade. This lawlessness caught the attention of the mighty Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. Unwilling to tolerate this in his domain, Shah Jahan ordered Qasim Khan, the governor of Bengal, to attack and expel them. In June 1632, the Mughal army laid siege to their fort, ultimately forcing the Portuguese to flee from Hooghly. To see how this history is tested, let's look at a question from the 2023 UPSC Civil Services examination. It asks, who among the following rulers of medieval Gujarat surrendered Diu to the Portuguese? The options are Ahmed Shah, Mahmud Bagarga, Bahadur Shah, and Muhammad Shah. Based on our discussion of Governor Nino da Cunha and the Treaty of 1534, you know the correct answer is option C, Bahadur Shah, who surrendered Diu while seeking help against the Mughal Emperor Humayun. To manage their vast trade network, the Portuguese established factories, which were essentially fortified warehouses, all along the Indian coastline. On the Malabar coast, they had Cochin, Cananore, and Quilon. Remember, their very first factory at Calicut in 1500 was actually abandoned by 1525 because the Zamorin wouldn't let them fortify it. Moving up to the Konkan coast, they built a factory at Chaul in 1516. In the northwest, they held Cambay, Diu, Surat, and others. On the eastern coast, they set up in Masulipatnam and Pulicat. And in Bengal, they established Chittagong in 1528 and Hooghly in 1579, the latter with explicit permission from the Mughal Emperor Akbar. So what exactly were they trading in these factories? The Portuguese participated in both Indo-European trade and intra-Asian trade. For the European market, they primarily exported spices, with black pepper being the most prized, alongside ginger, cinnamon, and cardamom. For the intra-Asian trade, they exported Indian textiles to Southeast Asia. However, they faced a major economic problem. Europe simply didn't produce goods that Asian merchants wanted to buy. To procure these valuable spices and textiles, the Portuguese had to pay in hard currency, bringing in massive amounts of West African gold and American silver reals from the west to the east. Here is another relevant question, this one from the 2003 UPSC exam. It asks you to identify the incorrect statement regarding the entry of European powers. Option A states, the Portuguese captured Goa in 1499. We know this is the incorrect statement, and therefore the right answer, because Alfonso de Albuquerque actually captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur in the year 1510, not 1499. On a slightly lighter note, the Portuguese left a delicious legacy in India, the Alfonso mango. This famous fruit derives its name from a Portuguese man named Afonso. Historians debate whether it was named after the fierce governor Afonso de Albuquerque or a Jesuit priest named Nicolau Afonso, who was an expert in grafting techniques. Regardless of its namesake, it became legendary. By the mid-1700s, Scottish voyager Alexander Hamilton declared it the best-tasting fruit in the world. Its prestige was so high that in 1937, colonial administrators shipped baskets of Alfonso mangoes all the way from Bombay to London for the coronation of King George VI. Returning to the military and trade conflicts, we must discuss the Marakkars, known as the Lords of the Arabian Sea. They were a powerful community of rich Muslim merchants on the Malabar coast. Initially, they collaborated with the Portuguese. But in the 1520s, when the Portuguese aggressively pushed their monopoly, the Marakkars resisted. In response, the Portuguese simply labeled them as pirates to justify eliminating them. The title Kunjali Marakkar was given to the admiral of the Zamorin's fleet. Over 80 years, 4 successive Kunjali Marakkars organized brilliant naval defenses against the Portuguese. Tragically, the 4th Kunjali Marakkar was eventually captured and executed by the Portuguese, shockingly with the support of a later Zamorin. You might wonder how a small nation like Portugal monopolized the Eastern trade for nearly a century, especially given their barbaric methods. Their success came down to several factors. First was their absolute naval supremacy. Their armed ships were technologically superior. Second, they ruthlessly combined force with trade, destroying Arab competitors and threatening Mughal shipping to extract concessions. Third, they largely operated in South India, safely outside the direct military might of the Mughal Empire. Furthermore, the Mughals were a land-based power with a very weak navy. Finally, the Portuguese expertly exploited mutual rivalries between local Indian princes, like the feud between Cochin and Calicut, all while maintaining strict military discipline. However, this golden age for Portugal couldn't last forever. In the second half of the 16th century, new European powers, England, Holland, and later France, began fighting for control of world trade. A massive blow came in 1580 when Portugal suffered a succession crisis and became a dependency of Spain. Then, in 1588, the English famously defeated the mighty Spanish Armada. This shattered Spanish and Portuguese naval supremacy forever. With the oceans now contested, English and Dutch merchants were free to use the Cape of Good Hope route to sail to India, aggressively joining the race for the wealth of the East. This influx of European powers led to intense rivalry. During the 17th century, the Dutch, English, and French all arrived in India. This created a massive economic problem. They all wanted to buy the exact same commodities. cotton, silk, pepper, and spices. This fierce competition drove up the purchase prices of these goods in India, which severely lowered their profit margins back in Europe. To survive and remain profitable, these trading companies realized they had to physically eliminate their rivals. Trade became militarized. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, European companies routinely sank each other's ships, blockaded trade routes, and heavily fortified their trading posts. The Portuguese found themselves losing ground rapidly. Against the English, they suffered a major loss when they were ousted from Surat in 1612. Things worsened in 1615 when the British ambassador Thomas Roe secured an imperial farman to trade throughout the Mughal Empire. This sparked naval battles that the British ultimately won by 1630. In a sign of their waning power, in 1662, the Portuguese actually gave the island of Bombay to England's King Charles II as part of a royal dowry. Meanwhile, the Dutch were dismantling Portuguese power in the south, capturing all their forts on the Malabar coast by 1663. Soon, Portugal was left with only Goa, Diu, and Daman. Ultimately, the vast Portuguese empire collapsed. The Dutch took over their strongholds in Indonesia, while the British gained control over India, Ceylon, and Malaya. However, the Portuguese stubbornly held on to their small enclaves of Goa, Daman, Diu, and Dadra and Nagar Haveli, collectively calling them Estado da India. They held these territories until 1961, when the modern Indian government finally reclaimed them through military action known as Operation Vijay. It is a fascinating historical irony that the Portuguese, who were the very first Europeans to arrive in India in 1498, were also the very last to depart. So why exactly could Portugal not maintain their monopoly? Several fatal flaws doomed them. First was their strict religious intolerance. Their use of forcible conversions made them deeply hated in India, where religious tolerance was the historical norm. Second, their dishonest and piratical trade practices constantly provoked local retaliation. Back home, Portuguese merchants had very little political power compared to landed aristocrats, meaning state policy didn't support trade efficiently. They also failed to innovate, lagging behind the Dutch and English in ship design. Furthermore, with a population of less than 1 million, Portugal simply lacked the manpower to govern a global empire, a problem compounded by a decadent royal court and ruined state finances. Despite their eventual decline, the significance of Portuguese rule in India cannot be overstated. They fundamentally changed how business was done. They were the first merchant group in Indian history to demand exclusive, monopolistic trading rights. They also introduced the concept of formal European-style commercial treaties to Indian rulers. Economically, their massive demand for specific cash crops began shifting Indian agricultural production to be more market-oriented for international trade. Finally, they left a lasting military legacy. Their highly disciplined method of drilling infantry groups was so effective that it was later adopted by the French, the English, the Marathas, and the Sikhs. As Portuguese power waned, the Dutch rose to prominence. In the 15th century, the Dutch were the middlemen of Europe. They bought Eastern goods from the Portuguese in Lisbon and distributed them throughout Northern Europe. This extensive maritime experience led them to develop superior scientific sailing techniques and highly efficient business methods. Their true game changer came in the 17th century with the invention of a ship called the flute. The flute was lighter, faster, and crucially, required a much smaller crew than the bulky Portuguese galleons. This drastically reduced their operational costs, allowing the Dutch to sail to the east themselves and outcompete the Portuguese on price. To organize this massive undertaking, the Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602. The Dutch Parliament gave it incredible power, the authority to wage war, sign treaties, and build fortresses. Interestingly, their primary focus was not India, but the Spice Islands in the Indonesian archipelago. India was initially viewed just as a convenient pit stop. However, they soon realized that to buy spices in Indonesia, they needed Indian cotton cloth, which was in massive demand there. So they set up operations in Gujarat and the Coromandel coast to buy textiles, which they then traded for Indonesian spices. By 1680, the Dutch absolutely dominated this intra-Asian trade network. To acquire these Indian textiles, the Dutch had to rely on what historians call the bullion for goods model. This was a common problem for all Europeans. The massive profits came from selling Asian spices in Europe, but European manufactured goods were of little interest to Indian or Indonesian merchants. Since the Dutch did not have enough trade commodities to barter with, they had to pay for Indian goods using bullion, raw precious metals like gold and silver. This resulted in a massive, continuous flow of European wealth directly into the Indian economy. To facilitate this trade, the Dutch established a network of factories. Their very first factory in India was set up at Musulipatnam in Andhra in 1605. They quickly expanded, establishing a major hub at Pulicat in 1609, which served as their headquarters for decades. They moved inland to places like Surat, Agra, and Patna to source textiles and saltpeter. By 1690, they shifted their main headquarters southward to Nagapatnam. Alongside building new factories, they systematically conquered Portuguese strongholds, taking Malacca in 1641, Ceylon in 1658, and Cochin in 1663, firmly cementing their dominance. Let's test this knowledge with a question from the 2022 UPSC exam. It asks you to identify the correct statements. Statement 1 claims the Dutch established factories on lands granted by Gajapati rulers. We know the Dutch arrived in the 17th century, but the Gajapati dynasty ended in the 16th century, making Statement 1 false. Statement 2 says Albuquerque captured Goa from the Bijapur Sultanate, which we know is true. Statement 3 regarding the English at Madras is also true. Therefore, the correct answer is option B, statements 2 and 3 only. Looking closer at their key settlements, Pulicat was established in 1609 with permission from the local Vijayanagar royalty. Here, the Dutch traded heavily in textiles and diamonds. To protect this wealth from the Portuguese and local rivals, they built the formidable Fort Geldria in 1613. The British and Dutch fought over Pulicat for years, until the British finally annexed it in 1825. Masulipatam is another fascinating case study in European rivalry. It was first held by the Portuguese, then taken by the Dutch in 1605. The English arrived and set up their own settlement there in 1611, using it as their headquarters until they eventually relocated to Madras. Here's a quick factual question from the 2003 UPSC exam. It asks, in India, among the following locations, the Dutch established their earliest factory at, the options are Surat, Pulicat, Cochin, and Qasim Bazar. While their absolute first factory was at Masulipatam in 1605, among the choices provided here, Pulicat, established in 1609, is the earliest. Therefore, option B is the correct answer. Ultimately, the Dutch presence in India declined due to relentless pressure from the English. As the English expanded their trade, conflicts of interest sparked intermittent Anglo-Dutch wars. A major compromise occurred in 1667, where the English agreed to leave Indonesia to the Dutch, and the Dutch agreed to step back from India. The final nail in the coffin was the Battle of Chinsura, also known as the Battle of Badara, in 1759. The Nawab of Bengal, Mir Jafar, invited the Dutch to help expel the British, but the British decisively crushed the Dutch forces. By 1795, the Dutch were completely expelled from India. While the Dutch never built a massive territorial empire in India, their coastal autonomous ports paved the way for the European powers that followed. This sets the stage perfectly for our next discussion on the aggressive expansion of British rule. Moving southward, the East India Company found conditions much more favorable for establishing their presence. Unlike the North, they didn't have to face the mighty Mughal Empire. The great Vijayanagara kingdom had been overthrown in 1565, leaving behind several small, weak states. Taking advantage of this, the English opened their first temporary factory in the south at Masulipatam in 1611, making it permanent by 1616. A major breakthrough came in 1632 when the Sultan of Golconda issued them the Golden Firman. For a mere 500 pagodas a year, the English were granted the right to trade freely in the ports of the Golconda Kingdom. The British soon realized they needed a more strategic base, so they shifted their center of activity from Masulipatam to Madras. In 1639, they received a highly favorable lease from the local ruler, the Raja of Chandragiri. This lease authorized the company to do 3 crucial things: fortify the place, administer the settlement, and even coin their own money. In return, the company simply promised to give half of their customs revenue to the Raja. They quickly built a small fort around their factory, which they named Fort St. George. By the end of the 17th century, the East India Company claimed full sovereignty over Madras and was fully prepared to fight to defend it. Let's look at the historical backdrop of this new headquarters. Chennai, originally known as Madras Patnam, was located in the province of Tondai-Mandalam, situated between the Pennar rivers of Nellore and Cuddalore. This region had a rich history, having been part of the Chola, Pandya, and Pallava kingdoms. In 1361, it was brought under Vijayanagar rule. Fast forward to the 17th century, the Vijayanagar ruler appointed Damarla Venkatapathy Nayak as the local governor. It was this Nayak who granted the piece of land to the British in 1639. The settlement that grew around the new British fort was named Chennapatnam, honoring the Nayak's father, Chennappa Nayak. The construction of Fort St. George was a monumental step for the British. Two representatives of the East India Company, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan, purchased the land specifically to construct this new stronghold. The fort was officially completed on April 23, 1644. Because this date coincided with St. George's Day, they named it after the patron saint of England. It is incredibly important to remember that Fort St. George was the very first fort constructed by the British in India, setting a precedent for their future military and commercial expansion. Following the success of Fort St. George, the British began fortifying other key settlements. Over in Bengal, as their trade grew, they built a fort around their settlement in 1696. By 1700, this was officially named Fort William, which would become the heart of British power in eastern India. Later, on the western coast in 1769, they constructed Fort George as an extension of the existing fortifications in Bombay. These forts were not just trading posts, they were heavily armed military installations designed to protect British interests from both European rivals and local rulers. Now, let's shift our focus to the west coast. The acquisition of Bombay is a fascinating piece of history. The island of Bombay was actually given to King Charles II of England as part of a royal dowry, which we will discuss shortly. In 1668, King Charles leased this island to the East India Company for an incredibly small sum of just £10 a year. The company immediately fortified the island. Recognizing its superior natural harbor and strategic location, the British officially shifted the seat of their Western presidency from Surat to Bombay in 1687, making it their new Western headquarters. Before Bombay took prominence, Surat was the crown jewel of Western trade. Located on the River Tapi, it was a vital trading city of the Mughal Empire. The Portuguese had dominated trade here since around 1540. However, by the early 17th century, English and Dutch traders aggressively displaced them. As the Mughal Empire's grip weakened, the British steadily increased their influence, finally taking direct control of Surat from the Mughals in 1759. By 1800, during the rule of Nasiruddin, the British had completely subjugated the entire city, cementing their absolute dominance in the region. Moving to eastern India, the English company was equally ambitious. They opened their very first factory in the east at Balasore in Orissa in 1633. This was followed by a crucial factory at Hooghly in Bengal in 1651. Bengal was incredibly wealthy, and the British wanted to maximize their profits. Through a series of firmans or royal decrees issued in 1651, 1656, and 1672, the English managed to secure a massive advantage. They were completely exempted from paying standard custom duties. Instead, they simply had to make a fixed annual payment, which drastically increased their profit margins. To put this rapid expansion into perspective, let's look at the timeline of important British factories established during the 17th century. They started in Surat in 1613, followed quickly by Masulipatam in 1616. They pushed inland to Patna by 1620 and Broach in 1623. Then came the eastern expansion to Balasore in 1633, the southern stronghold of Madras in 1639, Hooghly in Bengal in 1651, and finally the acquisition of Bombay in 1668. In just over 50 years, the East India Company had woven a massive network of fortified trading hubs across the entire Indian coastline. For most of the 17th century, the English were merely humble petitioners before the mighty Mughal authorities. An early attempt to fortify Surat in 1625 resulted in the immediate imprisonment of their chiefs. However, during Emperor Aurangzeb's reign, the dynamic shifted. Empowered by their heavily fortified settlements in Madras and Bombay, and flush with massive trading wealth, the British grew arrogant. Believing Aurangzeb was too distracted by his wars against the Marathas in the Deccan, the British abandoned their humble role. In 1686, they sacked Hooghly and outright declared war on the Mughal emperor, hoping to establish a total trade monopoly by force. This declaration of war was a massive miscalculation. The English severely underestimated the Mughal Empire, which was more than a match for the petty forces of the company. The war ended disastrously for the British. They were driven out of Bengal, their factories across the coast were seized, and their fort at Bombay was besieged. Forced to seek refuge on a swampy island, the English once again became humble petitioners. Surprisingly, in 1690, Aurangzeb pardoned them and allowed trade to resume after they paid a fine of 150,000 rupees. Why? Because their trade enriched the Mughal treasury. The emperor didn't yet see them as a territorial threat, and he knew the powerful British navy could easily destroy Indian merchant shipping in the Arabian Sea. Having learned their lesson, the British returned to diplomacy and bribery to expand their influence. In 1691, they secured an exemption from custom duties in Bengal for just 3,000 rupees a year. As their trade boomed, they persuaded local merchants to settle near their factory, and by 1696, they built a fort around it. In 1700, this became Fort William, the seat of the new Eastern Presidency under Sir Charles Eyre. Even more crucially, in 1698, the company bribed Mughal officials to acquire the zamindari, or land revenue rights, of 3 villages, Sultanati, Kalikata, and Govindpur. These 3 villages would eventually merge and grow into the massive metropolis of Calcutta. The company's ultimate diplomatic victory came in 1717, when Mughal Emperor Farrukhsiyar issued 3 historic farmans, or royal decrees. These decrees confirmed past privileges and extended them massively. First, they secured duty-free trade in Bengal for 3,000 rupees a year. Second, they got a blanket exemption from all duties in Surat for 10,000 rupees a year. Third, they retained their tax exemptions in Hyderabad and Madras. Fourth, and incredibly important, the coins minted by the company in Bombay were declared legal tender throughout the entire Mughal Empire. Finally, they were granted permission to rent even more territory around Calcutta. These 3 firmans issued by Farrukhsiyar were so transformative that historians refer to them as the Magna Carta of the East India Company. Just as the original 1215 Magna Carta shaped constitutional law in England, these decrees fundamentally shaped the rules of trade in India. They granted the English massive, undue advantages over both Indian merchants and other European rivals. While the volume of British trade skyrocketed, the fixed annual payments meant the Mughal state revenue did not increase at all, creating a severe drain on the imperial treasury and deeply embedding the British into Indian politics. Of course, the British weren't the only Europeans in India. Their early expansion deeply angered the Portuguese, leading to a decade of fierce naval battles from 1620 to 1630, which the British ultimately won. The rivalry eventually cooled through royal diplomacy. The Luso-English Treaty of 1661 sealed the marriage between King Charles II of England and the Portuguese Princess Catherine. This treaty was a massive windfall for England. They secured the 7 islands of Bombay, Tangier, and Morocco, global trading rights, and 2 million crowns. In exchange, Portugal received vital British military support in their ongoing war against Spain. The Bombay that King Charles received and later leased to the East India Company wasn't the single landmass we know today as Mumbai. It was actually an archipelago of 7 distinct islands. These included the main Isle of Bombay, Colaba, Old Woman's Island, also known as Little Colaba, Mazagan, Parel, Worli, and Mahim. Over the following centuries, the British would undertake massive land reclamation projects to merge these 7 separate islands into one continuous peninsula, creating the geographic foundation for the modern city. The British also faced intense competition from the Dutch. Intermittent warfare raged between the 2 powers from 1654 to 1667. Exhausted by the conflict, they finally reached a massive geopolitical compromise in 1667. The English agreed to give up all their claims to the lucrative spice islands of Indonesia, while the Dutch agreed to stop harassing English settlements in India. Ultimately, this divided Asia into spheres of influence. The Dutch took Indonesia, while the British focused on India, Ceylon, and Malaya. Despite the treaty, the English relentlessly chipped away at Dutch influence, completely expelling them from India by 1795. By the early 18th century, the British had established 3 massive fortified strongholds: Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These weren't just trading posts anymore. They were prosperous, heavily armed cities with direct access to the sea. This was their ultimate strategic advantage. Because the English Navy was vastly superior to any Indian fleet, these coastal forts provided an unbreakable lifeline. If a conflict arose with a local ruler, the British could retreat to their forts, resupply from the sea, or escape entirely. As the political situation in India grew increasingly unstable, these 3 cities served as the perfect launchpads for the total conquest of the subcontinent, setting the stage for their next major European rival, the French. The French were the last major European power to enter the Eastern trade. During the reign of King Louis XIV, his Minister of State, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, established the French East India Company in 1664. They quickly set up their first factory in Surat in 1668, which served as their initial headquarters. They expanded to Masulipatam the following year, and crucially secured Pondicherry in 1673, heavily fortifying it to serve as their new nerve center in India. By the 1690s, they had even established a presence in Bengal at Chandernagore. Establishing a foothold was not easy for the French. They faced immediate rivalry from the Dutch and the English. In fact, the Dutch temporarily captured Pondicherry in 1693, and by 1720, the French had lost several key settlements. However, the Mughal-English clash at Hooghly in 1686 had severely disrupted English trade, giving the French a vital window of opportunity. After a major reorganization in the 1720s, the French bounced back. They opened new factories on the Malabar and East coasts, gained permission from the Mughal emperor to mint their own coins, and crucially, acquired the islands of Mauritius and Reunion. This significantly boosted their naval power in the Indian Ocean. Pondicherry is famously associated with the French, but it actually changed hands many times. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish a factory there in 1523, followed by the Danes a century later. It was not until 1674 that François Martin transformed it into a flourishing French port town. The Dutch captured it briefly in 1693, but returned it via the Treaty of Ryswick. Later, during the intense Anglo-French rivalry, the British captured it in 1761, only to restore it to the French in 1773. The French ultimately retained Pondicherry right through the British domination of India. Let us look at how this history is tested. This UPSC 2010 question asks about the occupation of Pondicherry. Statement 1 is correct. The Portuguese were indeed the first in 1523. Statement 2 is incorrect because the Danes, not the French, were the second. Statement 3 is also incorrect because the English captured Pondicherry multiple times, notably in 1761 and 1793. Therefore, only the first statement is correct, making option A the right answer. Despite their ambitions, the French East India Company had fatal structural flaws. Unlike the independent British Company, the French EIC was heavily controlled by the French government. At the time, the French state was autocratic, semi-feudal, and plagued by instability and corruption. This stifled commercial agility. Furthermore, the major shareholders were French nobles, cared only about quick dividends rather than investing in long-term infrastructure. Combine this with inadequate capital and constant infighting among French officials in India, and the company was fundamentally handicapped. Before we dive into the massive Anglo-French conflicts, let us briefly mention two other European players. The Danes arrived in 1616. They established a fort at Tranquebar in Tamil Nadu, but never harbored ambitions to build an empire. Their success was limited, and they eventually sold their factories to the British, leaving India in 1845. The Swedish East India Company was formed in 1731, but they bypassed Indian politics entirely, focusing their trading activities almost exclusively on China. Here is a quick knowledge check from the 2008 UPSC exam. Who were the last Europeans to come to pre-independence India as traders? As we discussed earlier, the Portuguese were first in 1498, followed by the Dutch and the English in the early 1600s. The French East India Company was not founded until 1664, making them the latecomers to the Eastern trade. The correct answer is the French. By the late 17th century, the British had sidelined the Portuguese and the Dutch, leaving France as their sole major rival. This rivalry erupted into the Carnatic Wars, a 20-year struggle from 1744 to 1763. The conflict was initially sparked by the Austrian War of Succession back in Europe, but it quickly took root in India due to local political instability. Following the 1740s, power struggles erupted for the throne of the Nawab in the Carnatic and the Nizam in Hyderabad. Both the English and the French saw this turmoil as a golden opportunity to interfere, install puppet rulers, and secure trade monopolies.
The First Carnatic War was essentially the Indian theater of the War of the Austrian Succession. Hostilities began when the English Navy captured French ships off the southeast coast. The French Governor-General, Joseph-François Dupleix, was a brilliant strategist. Lacking a local fleet, he waited for reinforcements from Mauritius, then boldly attacked and occupied the British settlement of Madras in 1746. Desperate, the British appealed to Anwar ud-Din, the Nawab of Carnatic, to protect their territory. The Nawab agreed to help the British, wanting to assert his authority over these foreign merchants. He sent his son with a massive Mughal army of 10,000 soldiers. They met the French at the Battle of Odyar, also known as St. Thome. The French force was tiny, just 230 Europeans and 700 Indian soldiers trained in Western military tactics. Shockingly, this small, disciplined French force decisively routed the Nawab's massive army. This battle was a watershed moment. It proved that traditional Indian military techniques were no match for modern, disciplined European warfare. The First Carnatic War concluded in 1748, when peace was declared in Europe through the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Under this treaty, territories were swapped back. The French returned Madras to the English in India, and the English returned territories to the French in North America. However, the genie was out of the bottle.
The war had exposed the glaring weaknesses of Indian armies and governments. Both European companies now realized that with a small, well-trained force, they could easily manipulate local rulers and expand their own territories. This realization led directly to the Second Carnatic War. Dupleix formulated a cunning strategy. He would offer his highly disciplined French army to Indian princes involved in succession disputes, in exchange for massive territorial and financial rewards. The perfect storm brewed with simultaneous succession crises. In the Carnatic, Chanda Sahib challenged the current Nawab. In Hyderabad, Muzaffar Jung challenged Nasser Jung for the Nizam's throne. The French backed Chanda Sahib and Muzaffar Jung, while the British, terrified of French dominance, backed their rivals, Muhammad Ali and Nasser Jung. Dupleix's strategy initially worked flawlessly. In 1749, the French coalition defeated and killed Nawab Anwar-Din at the Battle of Ambur. Chanda Sahib took the throne of the Carnatic and rewarded the French with 80 villages. In Hyderabad, the French-backed Muzaffar Jung became the Nizam. The rewards were staggering. Dupleix was actually appointed governor of all Mughal dominions south of the Krishna River, and the French gained highly lucrative territories, including Masulipatam. French power in India was at its absolute zenith. But the British were not about to give up. The deceased Nawab's son, Muhammad Ali, had fled to Trichinopoli, and the French and Chanda Sahib laid siege to it. Enter Robert Clive, a young British officer with a brilliant, risky plan. Instead of fighting at Trichinopoli, Clive took a small force and attacked Arcot, the capital of the Carnatic. The diversion worked perfectly. Chanda Sahib had to pull troops away to defend his capital. Clive held Arcot against massive odds, turning the tide of the war. Eventually, with help from Maratha allies, Chanda Sahib was defeated and killed. Just as the war hung in the balance, the French government made a fatal error. Terrified of the mounting financial costs and worried about their colonies in America, they sued for peace. The British demanded the recall of Dupleix, and the French agreed. Dupleix was replaced by Godeheu, who signed the Treaty of Pondicherry in 1754. The treaty dictated that both companies stop interfering in local politics and recognize the British ally, Muhammad Ali, as Nawab. Recalling Dupleix, their most visionary leader, was a devastating blow from which the French company never truly recovered. Peace was short-lived. In 1756, the 7 Years' War broke out in Europe, sparking the Third Carnatic War in India. The French sent a formidable general, Count Delali, to crush the British. However, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. The British had recently won the Battle of Plassey in 1757, giving them access to the vast wealth of Bengal. This endless stream of revenue allowed the British to fund a massive, well-equipped army in the south, while the French forces were starved of resources. The British even managed to oust the French from Hyderabad, becoming the new protectors of the Nizam. The decisive clash came on January 22, 1760, at the Battle of Wandiwash. The British general Ayar Kut completely crushed the French forces under Count Delali. The following year, the British captured and destroyed the French capital of Pondicherry. The conflict officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. While the French were given their factories back, there was a humiliating catch. They were forbidden from fortifying them or maintaining troops. The French dream of an Indian empire was dead. They were reduced to mere traders living under British protection. Why did the English triumph so absolutely? First, the English company was vastly wealthier and held total naval superiority, meaning they could resupply their troops while the French were cut off. Second, the English EIC was a private enterprise driven by profit and efficiency, whereas the French company was bogged down by state bureaucracy. Third, the British had 3 massive fortified bases in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, while the French relied almost entirely on Pondicherry. Finally, the British boasted brilliant commanders like Clive and Coote, while the French government foolishly recalled their only strategic genius to Cliques. To summarize this complex period, here is a quick reference guide to the Carnatic Wars. The First War, from 1746 to 1748, featured the Battle of Saint-Thomé and ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The Second War, from 1749 to 1754, was defined by the Battle of Ambur and concluded with the Treaty of Pondicherry. Finally, the Third War, from 1758 to 1763, culminated in the decisive Battle of Wandiwash and was settled by the Treaty of Paris, securing British dominance. Looking at the broader picture of European arrival, we can see the timeline of their corporate establishments. The English East India Company was formed in 1600, the Dutch in 1602, and the French much later in 1664. Their centers of power also shifted over time. The Portuguese moved their capital from Cochin to Goa. The Dutch shifted from Pulakat to Nagapattinam. The British, however, uniquely established 3 massive presidencies to control the subcontinent: Madras in the south, Bombay in the west, and Calcutta in the east. To wrap up this era, we see a clear progression from trade to empire. It started in 1498 with Vasco da Gama seeking spices, leading to a century of Portuguese dominance. The 17th century brought the Dutch, the English, and eventually the French, turning the Indian coast into a chessboard of European corporate rivalry. But the defining turning point was the 20-year span of the Carnatic Wars. By 1763, the English had systematically dismantled their European rivals. Free from outside competition, the British East India Company could now turn its full, undivided attention to the systematic conquest of the Indian subcontinent.